Okay, hope everyone can hear me still. Thank you for joining us for our latest Kumi Now online gathering. I see some friends here, some new folks as well. So that's great. So if you're new here, I'll make sure to send some links to our Kumi Now website. If you saw, we have a Kumi Now action page, so that kind of helps with certain actions that we try to highlight each week. And if we have time at the end of the session, I'll also make sure to share some actions that we can do together. And I'll also link later on during the session Sabil's website as well, if anyone's curious in terms of our programs and other things. Today, we have the privilege of being joined by Dr. Esther McIntosh and Dr. Sharon Jagger. They're two friends of Sabil, and I'll introduce them in a bit, but they will be speaking on teaching theology, religion, and ethics in relation to Palestine. They were actually on the most recent delegation in Sabil in June, and I think Hunter, who led the delegation, is also here today. And I think they were actually the last delegation that we had before, the escalations with Iran happened. And so we've been pausing delegations for this month, but hopefully we can go back. So they're kind of the last witnesses internationally, in terms of visiting Sabil. Esther McIntosh is a professor of feminist theology and ethics and director of the Center for Religion and Society at York St. John University. And Dr. Sharon Jagger is an associate professor in religion at York St. John. And I'm sure you guys can, say a few more words about yourself. But they'll be giving this presentation. We'll probably give them about 30 to 40 minutes to speak and then have some time for a Q&A. So thank you, Sharon, Esther, for joining us and for giving your time today to speak on this really important issue.
Thank you. Let me just see if I can share the slides. Can you see the slides there? Because I can't.
I can see the slide, but I think maybe you can turn it full screen.
Sorry, let me try again.
At the lower right-hand corner, or a little bit over from the right-hand corner, that looks a bit like a screen. It's right next to the sliding bar, just to the left of it. If you click on that,
If not, I just pulled the presentation up, if you want me to share it instead.
Yeah, because it's not actually giving me any controls. It's not showing me anything.
Okay.
Stop share or pause.
Let me try to do this.
Under slideshow setup, if you go to the, we can now see the whole screen. Can you see it?
Okay, so I think I just shared it, so hopefully, can everyone see the screen right now?
Yes.
yes.
Okay, awesome. So, yeah, Esther, just let me know when I can, click on the next.
All right. Thanks, Tan. Okay, so as Tan said, I'm a professor of feminist theology and ethics at York St. John University, where I also direct the Centre for Religion and Society. And I'm also a trustee with Sabil Kairos UK. So much like Friends of Sabil in North America, we're the kind of like UK branch of that. And as Tan mentioned, Sharon and I were on the recent theological delegation to the West Bank in June this year, and we arrived back just 3 days before Israel started bombing Iran, and then the West Bank was all locked down and flights were grounded and so on. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about how we talk about Palestine in our teaching our students at university. We already included Palestine in some parts of our program, but we've been thinking more about the meaning of some terms that are used at our university and other universities, terms like decolonization, anti-racism, social justice. We've been especially thinking about the ways in which these terms are used since the 7th October 2023, but we were thinking about it before that. So just to give you some context, we have a 3-year undergraduate degree program. There are 2 routes through that program. One is called Religion, Philosophy and Ethics, and the other is called Religion and Theology. And we also have 2 joint honours streams, one with history and one with literature. But modules are shared across those different routes through the degree program. And we're going to talk about some of the modules and places that we bring Palestine into the conversation in that program. Just to say, the majority of the pictures that you're going to see today are ones that we took during our delegation in June. So these are from very recently, from the last month. On the left-hand side, the olive tree with the Free Palestine sign is from Issa Amro's garden. Many of you will know he's a human rights activist and was in a recent BBC documentary by Louis Theroux that was shown here in the UK. And as a result, a fire was set on his land in retaliation for doing that. And we saw the remnants of that while we were there. And that's just a date farm in the middle. But on the right-hand side, this was just if you like, a fortuitous moment for us. We were passing through by the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. And at the time, a whole group of female IDF new graduates came out into the square and were posing to take graduation photos. And it was just quite a juxtaposition. These young women, these teenagers with their assault rifles posing for photos, whilst in the background you could see the Jewish men praying against the Western Wall. The women's section was to the right. So if you could move the slide on, thanks, Tan. Okay, and again, if you click again. Great, thank you. So level 4 is the first year of our degree program. And so a couple of modules that are of particular relevance to the context of talking about Palestine here are World Christianity and Foundations of Theology. So as you'll know, Palestine is the historic birthplace of Christianity. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew and was oppressed by the Roman Empire. Bethlehem being the place of his birth and Jerusalem the place of his death are both in the occupied West Bank. And the picture on the right with the flames there you can see is a picture of the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the Holy Fire. And what we experienced, what we saw while we were there, is that the road that used to be a 15-kilometer run between Jerusalem and Ramallah, for taking that fire from the Holy Sepulchre Church to Ramallah, now takes over 4 hours to drive, because the apartheid wall, which you can see in the bottom left, has been inserted directly across that main road between Jerusalem and Ramallah. So this is what occupation and apartheid looks like. And this is the impact it has, that even in these religious celebrations, their path is blocked by this apartheid wall. Palestinian Christians are not allowed to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at Easter, even though tourists flock from all over the world to go to that church. We've always taught liberation theology in theology degree programs, but liberation theology tends to be taught from the perspective of Latin American theology. And what came through quite strongly for us was that we need to be talking a lot more about Palestinian liberation theology and the difference between Palestinian liberation theology and Latin American liberation theology. Even for some of our students in the UK, I think the government and the media rhetoric will use the term or the phrase Allahu Akbar when they're referring to Islamists or jihadi terrorists. And I think it's really significant for our students to realise that Christians who speak Arabic will also say Allahu Akbar, that this is just Christian, this is just Arabic for God is great. And similarly, the term Israel, we know that a lot of Christians have a sort of an emotional connection to feeling like they need to support the state of Israel because Israel is in the Bible, rather than thinking that this occurred the other way around, that the state of Israel took that term Israel from the Bible, and the Bible is now being weaponized against Palestinian Christians to support the state of Israel. But that term Israel in the Bible is not referring to the current state of Israel. And just, the picture of Month for Isaac there with the Christ in the rubble from Christmas, Christmas 2023. I'm sure lots of you will be familiar with that picture. When we were in Ramallah, we were invited to Mother Isaac's inauguration, his installation in the church in Ramallah. And the picture in the middle is the tomb where Jesus was buried, over which the Holy Sepulchre Church has been built. That tomb was surrounded by builders while we were there, but because we had a Palestinian guide with us, he became very passionate about the fact that this is where he grew up as a child. This is where he played as a child. And now there are all sorts of places in occupied East Jerusalem he's not allowed to go as a Palestinian, even though he was allowed to go as a child. This really brought across to us how recent much of the apartheid and occupation rules and restrictions are. They don't all date back to 1948. Some of this is post 2000. And we weren't really supposed to go near this tomb because it was surrounded by builders. There's restoration work going on. But because I was the smallest person on the delegation, he did switch the torch on his phone and handed it to me and told me to crawl in and shine the light so the rest of the delegation could see. So that is the tomb where Jesus was buried and raised from the dead. Thanks, Tan. If you could click on again.
So I'm teaching at level 4, studying religion and religion, peace and conflict. So in studying religion, it's designed to give students a foundation in study skills. So when they come to us, we need to make sure that they have that kind of sense of critical thinking, being able to do the research. So that's the opportunity for us to draw on Palestine as a case study for lots of different ways of studying religion. So we'll introduce them to sociological ideas, political ideas, and that gives them a broad view of what they can then go on to study later on in the programme. And the idea of coexistence, particularly in Jerusalem, where the Abrahamic faiths sort of come together, and we saw as we were being taken around East Jerusalem and the older sites, the evidence of that coexistence. So it's introducing students to that sort of birthplace of the religions that they're going to be interested in studying themselves. And in religion, peace and conflict, this is new to me this year. So I'm going to take the opportunity to focus on the peace movements, the Quakers, for example, and certainly in the UK, we've had some incidents with Quakers being sort of disturbed by the kind of crackdown on protest, really. So they're quite active. And I know there is a history of Quakers in Palestine as well. So that's allowing students to have a look at, in broader terms, the notion of people working for peace and it not being such a binary understanding of the conflict as well. So, Tan, if you want to click on, thanks. And at level 5, so religion and politics is really where I've taught this for several years now, and I've always included at least 2 sessions on Israel and Palestine. So for the last 3 years, it's become much more current and interesting for students. When I first started to talk about this, students were very uncomfortable and didn't want it to be even-handed with this. They very quickly have come to understand that that's not the point of looking at this subject at all. And I have had student complaints, but they've more or less come from a place of not really understanding how they're allowed to position themselves as scholars, really. So the religion and politics session talks about it gives them opportunity to look at the context, the background. We do quite a lot of history on it. We'll talk later about ways that we're amplifying some of that context and giving them a chance to look further into the history. We certainly talk about Christian Zionism in the US context, mostly because it's current in terms of Donald Trump and how the US foreign policy has been influenced by Christian Zionism and white Christian nationalism as well. But also we make it clear Britain's original role in the creation of Israel. And I'm sure you've heard on the news, we have issues around protest and repression of voices. So that gives us something to, there's a picture there in the middle. I won't say it. There is a certain protest group that has been prescribed, but there's still lots of activity on social media. So students will be able to wrestle with that, how that produces a context in the UK in terms of how people speak out and protest. Massive Life and Death.
So I teach Matters of Life and Death at level 5. So this is the second year of our degree programme. And in Matters of Life and Death, we look at various moral issues in applied ethics. So this builds on moral theory that the students have learned in the first year of their programme. And we start to apply it using philosophical method, defining concepts, setting out arguments, counter-arguments, using critical analysis. So they can come to their own opinion over which are the weakest and the strongest arguments, the least convincing, and so on. So we try to steer them away from writing about the topic or rehashing standard arguments that they might have already come across in school. So there are various topics in this module that are relevant to talking about Palestine. So one topic we cover, for example, is war and terrorism. One of the first things I say to the students is that the Vietnam War is not called that in Vietnam. And that's usually quite an eye-opening moment for them to realize that we have this illusion of neutrality and we need to think about our epistemological bias and the perspective from which we're coming from, that even history that seems like facts is actually being presented in a particular way from a particular perspective. So in Vietnam, it's called the Resistance War Against America. So as an act of decolonization, we engage in this practice of challenging knowledge. So we talk about the definition of war and just war coming from Catholic moral theory, primarily the concepts of necessity and proportionality. And in this respect, I do discuss with the students the fact that what's happening in Gaza is not a war, it's not a conflict. We've got very asymmetrical sides here. Gaza does not have an army, and the Geneva Convention, the ICJ and Amnesty International have all been quite clear that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. According to the Genocide Convention, this is the deliberate destruction of a nation on ethnic, racial, or religious group. And so we don't shy away from talking about that terminology. We do also highlight the fact that the definition of terrorist is ambiguous, and that states tend to refer to themselves as acting in defense, and they refer to others as engaging in acts of terror. Others who might call themselves liberationists or freedom fighters, for example, will be called terrorists by governments. Margaret Thatcher, one of our former prime ministers, called Nelson Mandela a terrorist during the time of apartheid in South Africa. So who is the real terrorist is a question we ask. The chart on the left bottom of your screen there gives the UN statistics up to 2020 and shows that 5,590 Palestinians were killed at the same time as 251 Israelis. And the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem also has reported that between 2000 and 2014, over 8,000 people were killed, but 7,000 of those, 87%, were Palestinian. And we know the current death toll since October 2023 is up in the 60,000s of Palestinians, compared with 1,000 Israelis. One of the key topics we talk about in this module as well is civil disobedience. So I've been teaching students about civil disobedience for some time. We discuss whether we actually have a moral duty to break the law when the laws are immoral. Nobody now criticizes Rosa Parks for breaking the law or criticizes Martin Luther King for engaging in civil disobedience. So up to now, I have talked about Palestine Action as being a group that engages in non-violent direct action in an attempt to stop the genocide in Gaza by disabling arms factories. As Sharon mentioned, the UK government has in the last few days prescribed Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation. So we now have to talk about this in the context of that prescription, and what that means for direct action and the legal process for challenging that prescription. So related to that, I also talk about Quakers and Methodists who've actually won legal cases for damaging BAE Systems sites on religious grounds. They argue on religious grounds that they have a duty to save lives and prevent war crimes. I also talk about AI and surveillance in that module. I've discussed previously the case of unmanned drones that are killing from a distance in other countries. America, the UK, and Israel have all killed people in other countries using unmanned drones. Is this ethical? Who is accountable for errors in these cases? And then the picture on the right there, you will see, I took that in East Jerusalem while we were there a few weeks ago, and you can see the sheer number of cameras on that one post. In East Jerusalem, you are never more than 5 meters from being surveilled. Amnesty International referred to this as automated apartheid. Some of these cameras use facial recognition, and this violates the human rights of Palestinians. Thanks, Tom.
And another level 5 module is sociology of religion. So this gives students a chance to take some of the abstract theoretical lenses and apply them to what they're seeing on their news feeds right now about Palestine. So particularly the surveillance, we talk about Foucault and his notion that when a state is violent towards a population, that signals a loss of power, actually. So using that Foucauldian lens, they can start to talk about what Israel is doing in Palestine. And the Foucault's very interesting on the Benthamite panopticon and that notion of surveillance. So that gives students a chance to look at some quite sophisticated sociological theories, but applying them to what they're seeing in Palestine. And the next one.
Yeah, so religion and genocide is a module that was updated from being a module on the Holocaust. And this was at the students' request. So this module used to be taught as a Holocaust module. And the students were saying, but there are lots of other genocides happening. Why do we only talk about genocide in relation to the Holocaust? So the purpose of updating this module is to try to avoid Eurocentric Holocaust exceptionalism and to also talk about the way Holocaust memory is used and sometimes weaponized. In this module, we talk about religious actors, both as perpetrators and as victims in genocide. So in Rwanda, for example, religious actors appeared both as perpetrators and as victims. And this module, one of the assessments on this module is a sort of case study. So the students will pick a genocide and look at the role of religious actors, either as perpetrators or as victims or as both within that genocide. So, of course, the State of Israel was created as a safe space for Jews, but by oppressing Palestinians. And it's not safe for all Jews. One of our colleagues works on, does research with Ethiopian Jews who are severely discriminated against in the State of Israel in terms of access to jobs, healthcare, and so on. And also we talk about the Armenian genocide. One of our colleagues is from Turkey, Muslim woman from Turkey, and she can't use the term genocide in her research in relation to the Armenian genocide, or she won't be allowed to go back to Turkey and visit her mom. So that term is still considered contentious in Turkey. And when we were in Palestine a few weeks ago, we met the Armenian Christians who are now at risk in Palestine too. So the poster there of the Armenian genocide is one that's on the Armenian Quarter in occupied East Jerusalem. And then the space there is part of the Save the Ark campaign to save this land in East Jerusalem for the Armenians, to make this part of community land and not allow it to be sold off by the church. And in relation to the genocide in Gaza, we also talk about the silent genocide in the West Bank. So Rifat Karsis, the human rights activist, has referred to the silent genocide in the West Bank, which happens in a number of ways. The picture at the bottom left there is a home demolition, hospital and homes that were demolished. This is in Silwan, where some of you may be familiar with the area where they paint eyes on the sides of buildings. Eyewitness Silvan project, because all these homes have been given demolition orders so that the state of Israel can claim this as a biblical park, the King David Park, this area, and this will make thousands of Palestinians homeless. And we have in the third year, we have a module on religion and visual culture. I'm currently in conversation with a colleague there about whether the Eyewitness Silwan project might become part of that module too. We also met people who've been arrested and tortured. And we also know of shootings by the army and by settlers in Jenin, in Hebron, in the Ida refugee camp. The picture in the middle at the bottom there is the watchtower and the wall that is right within the Ida refugee camp. And teenage boys have been shot in their own homes and in the streets of the Ida refugee camp from that watchtower. And then afterwards, the Israeli army has said they were shot by mistake. Thanks, Tom. So level 6 is the third year of our degree program. I teach a module on feminist ethics and religion at this level, and this builds on the applied ethics that we just talked about at level 5 in matters of life and death. So for feminist ethics, issues such as gender-based violence and reproductive rights have been key issues for feminism for decades. But the West, or the global North, has been critiqued for its lack of intersectional awareness in relation to these issues. Indigenous and colonized people have been forcibly sterilized in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and so on. So a social justice and anti-racist approach to these issues means considering class, race, and it means expanding solidarity. So we move beyond a neoliberal individualism. The students are very keen to talk about human rights and what are my rights. And I try to impress on them that ethics means moving beyond that individualistic approach to rights. Rights can be helpful in a legal sense, but solidarity is much more than focusing on your individual rights. We need to talk about equitable access. But there has been relative silence of feminism on Palestine, even while reports of sexualized violence and repricide are widespread. So repricide refers to the aspect of the genocide that's connected with reproduction. So women in the West Bank giving birth at checkpoints, women in Gaza having cesareans without anesthetic, fertility clinics being bombed, and so on. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry, which the headline from that is in that picture there, told the Human Rights Council in March 2025 that gender-based violence and the destruction of reproductive health care amounts to crimes against humanity and genocidal acts. So this is a report from just a couple of months ago. So Palestine is very much a feminist issue, and we should be talking about it in feminist ethics. In fact, feminist theologians in the 60s to the 80s to the 90s really, saw the connection more clearly between feminist ethics or feminist theology and Palestine. So Rosemary Radford Ruether, a very famous American feminist theologian, she wrote the foreword to a number of books in Palestinian liberation theology in the 80s and 90s. But most students who study Rosemary Radford Ruether do not hear about that aspect of her work. So I was working on the silence of feminist theology in relation to Palestine just immediately before we went to Palestine on the delegation. I was giving a paper in Canada at a conference there talking about this issue. But while we were there, this was reiterated to us. Where are the feminists? Why are they silent on this issue? Thanks, Tom.
And religion and globalization, that's an opportunity to look more broadly at the Palestinian diaspora, and particularly in relation to some of the conversations we had about Palestinian theology, the question of how Palestinian theologians who don't live in Palestine, who live in all sorts of parts of the world, how they can come together, and how they can then speak outwards as well as inwards. So that religion and globalization module gives us an opportunity to explore that. And the dissertations as well. Lots of students start to think about their dissertations as they're moving through the program, and a lot of them will end up wanting to take one of these aspects and look more deeply for themselves. This is an opportunity for students to really follow up and deepen their understanding of one particular aspect of what we present to them. So we will really encourage them to consider some of these broader issues, and then going more deeply as independent scholars. And that's in the 3rd year.
Okay, so just to sort of round off then, in other parts of the world, colonization and apartheid is now considered shameful. So why is this not the case for Palestine? As I mentioned at the beginning, universities claim that they're doing decolonizing work, that they're doing anti-racism and social justice work. In our own university, as in many others around the UK, it's been very supportive of Ukraine. It flew a Ukrainian flag from the building you can see in the backdrop to my screen here. It has a collection for Ukraine, but it's very hesitant to talk about Palestine. Is this Islamophobia? Is it racism? Is it to do with the Eurocentric idea of a white Jesus and various missionary endeavors connected to that? One of our graduate attributes is that our students are supposed to be globally aware. So we want to bring the concept of decolonizing Palestine into that conversation about decolonization at the university. Thanks, Tom.
The student feedback's been really interesting. So I did mention I had a couple of complaints a few years ago, but now the context seems to have changed, and students have specifically fed back to our head of school that they want more information about the context of Palestine. They recognise that people are talking about it and it's coming up in their modules. So they're now asking, right from the beginning of their programme, can they have access to much more information that they can have a look at? So we've taken that as a positive thing and a green light. So we're building, we use a platform called Moodle. So we're building a Moodle module that will be accessible to all our students and potentially university-wide as well, that will break down some of the history, the context, the politics, the different actors and voices, so they will have access to specific reading lists, and they can then follow their interests. They can look at the news and then go to that Moodle site and fill in the gaps in knowledge that they might have. So we're going to spend the summer building that, and that can be an ongoing repository of information. I'm delighted that we got that feedback, because that means that the school itself is invested in us providing that as a repository of information. We also have it's a sector-wide agenda that asks us to put in to all our modules work-related experiential learning, which means we look at our assessments and try and tailor them to something that might be the students might experience in the world of work. That is actually an opportunity for us to include perhaps Sabeel or Sabeel Kairos, or organisations that are working in to raise awareness or working directly in Palestine, and to ask students to perhaps do an assignment that helps a particular organisation, whether it be research, writing up a report. So that's a really excellent opportunity for us to bring students into contact with organisations that are currently working. That probably needs some discussion and working out in partnership with other organisations, but that could be quite a long-term thing that we embed into several of the modules we've talked about.
Yeah, and part of what we'll be doing over the summer as well is like adding to our library resources and reading lists, and these two books here by Mitri Raheb and Naim Atik, which some of you are probably familiar with, just very accessible and give quite a clear account of the history, the land, the people, and the way the Bible's being used, as well as the history of Sabeel too. So we'll be recommending these resources. Okay, thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much, Esther and Sharon. This was a really wonderful presentation. Let me stop the share so we can just have any questions. If you guys have questions, please put it in the chat and I'll make sure to relay it to both Esther and Sharon. In the meantime, I'll start off with a few questions. I think the first question that I have, I think you kind of provided some of the context of, there's been a repression of freedom of speech within the academy. There's a paralyzing effect in the academy, and a crisis really in these academic institutions. And kind of given the fact that you're teaching almost in opposition to what the broader mainstream academy is promoting, what do you see as the future of academia and in light of this crisis right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And a tricky one. I think we're at quite a tense moment. It feels like if enough people are prepared to stand up and engage in civil disobedience or to challenge management at the academy, then we can keep doing what we're doing and we can continue that work and those voices. But if people hide behind their fear, then the repression just gets worse and worse and worse. And so I feel like we're at a bit of a crunch point here now in terms of seeing how people respond. I'm on weekly demonstrations in Leeds where I live, and those demonstrations have remained strong since October 2023 until now, week in, week out. And at various points, there have been attempts to repress those, and it's not worked because people are determined to carry on protesting. At the university, at our university, the first ceasefire event we called was in November 2023. We were kicked off campus, we were locked out, the police were called, I was threatened with disciplinary action and so on. But they didn't actually have any background to their claims in their attempts to repress us. So other events since then we have held on campus, but there's an increasing use of bureaucratic hoops to make us jump through more bureaucratic hoops than we had to, for example, for organizing things to do with Ukraine. So there's a different way of kind of hiding the repression, if you like. But I just hope there are enough people who are willing and able to remain resistant to that repression and to stand up and be counted. Sharon, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yes, it was interesting how students have potentially become less complaining. If that's it's not a very articulate way of saying it, but they were a few years ago, very unsure. You mentioned Al Jazeera to them, and then that seems to have created a fuss because they've not really heard of it before and assumed it was something that wasn't mainstream and good journalism. But now I think they've been exposed to a lot of this on social media, and not on the BBC, unfortunately, but on other ways that they get their news, and obviously hear us referring to it a lot. So I think, and that is the most important sea change, if you like, because if students are able to, the university wants students to be happy, and if students are on moving along this journey of understanding, then I think that is a very powerful thing, powerful leverage for the university. Hence, students' comments paving the way for us to be able to produce this repository of information that could be used university-wide.
Thank you both. Another question I have is, you guys recently went on a delegation with Sabeel, so I'm curious of your reflections on the use of, in-person learning and going on the ground and witnessing and interacting with communities. How has that kind of helped shape the way you guys will approach teaching in the future, but also like what's the benefit for students of doing this, and do you see any benefit of having delegations of this kind?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the delegations are really important. Both, before we went, the various Palestinians who we met were saying, like, come and see, you need to come and see what our life is like under occupation. And so that you can go and tell, as Sabine says, come see, go tell. So we felt it was important to go for that reason. Whilst we were there, it became very clear that it doesn't matter how much you watch pictures on the news or online of the apartheid wall, and how much you read and how much you know, the actual experience is qualitatively different. And so we now feel like, we have something more of that experience. Obviously, going in through Jordan and having to go over the bridge gave us just an inkling of what it's like for Palestinians and what they have to go through all the time, being taken around by Palestinians who were able to tell us about, like I was saying, about places they used to be able to go as children, now they're not allowed to go, how recent all of this is and how it's all been allowed to happen without the international community doing anything. But then also places like, Ida refugee camp that are, refugee camps that are 70 years old, and yet people are still in refugee camps, still wanting the right to return. So seeing all of that in person gives us more of an insight into what we're talking about, and I think in some ways gives us more credibility in terms of talking about it. Quite often on a demonstration, people shout at you, well, why don't you go to Palestine then? And to be able to say, I just did, sort of takes away what they think is the sting of their comment, and enables us to talk about it from that firsthand experience. The difficulty for us in getting students, I would love for our students to go and experience it firsthand. Our students mostly come from a low socioeconomic background. Quite often they're first in their family to go to university. Quite often they have caring responsibilities for their parents. We live in the north of England and they can't afford to go to London, let alone go anywhere outside of the country. So it's not really possible for us to take our students to Palestine. But to be able to show them pictures that we took while we were there, and to be able to talk to them about people we met while we were there, just adds a kind of another layer of credibility to what we're doing.
And I don't want to engage in hyperbole, but I'm going to. For me, it was almost life-changing. I don't think that's overstating it. Before, I was teaching from books and media clips in quite almost a dispassionate way, but even though I've always felt very strongly about it, but I never felt I had the credibility, as Esther says, to teach it in a much more lively way, if you like. It always felt like a side project for me because my research is about something completely different. So it always felt like it wasn't something I was an authority on, still not, hasten to add. But this has completely transformed me in that how I approach the teaching, because it does feel like I can say I've been there, I've met people, I've now, to me there's nothing else happening. It's very very interesting how I've become much more engaged in the books that I've already bought but never read, in following social media, commentary, and so now I feel like I am on a journey myself that I want to bring students on. So I mean, you can't replace that. You can't do that without having been and seen things and met people. It has just completely transformed my approach, and it's also helped us be able to put other resources together, like doing a podcast that people are actually interested because we've been, rather than it be a some academics have written some papers on it. It's a much more lively thing to be able to talk about that engages people.
Yeah, thank you both for your reflections. I think Hunter has a great question here. He says, can you help us think about the implications of the added responsibility educational institutions bear, given their primary commitment to formation? And he's thinking specifically for places of formation of religious and community leaders.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, they bear a huge responsibility. The majority of our students are not going for ordination. We teach in a secular institution, but I've worked for some time with the Society for the Study of Theology, and back in November 2023, when the call for repentance came from Palestinian Christians, I shared that with the Society for the Study of Theology, and lots of the people who are members of the Society for the Study of Theology are trained students in ordination who are going into the ministry. And, you know, and I presented that to them and said, you need to respond. This is a call for you to respond. You need to call out Christian Zionism. You need to engage in BDS. You need to center Palestinian liberation theologians' voices, and so on. And they took months and months and months to debate what they were going to do. Then they decided they weren't going to respond. So in the end, we progressed this to an open letter, which gathered a lot of signatures. And we then sent them the open letter and said, look, there's now an open letter calling on you to respond. And then eventually they debated this at their AGM, at their annual conference, and still procrastinated and procrastinated for another whole year until we said we were going to boycott the next annual conference. And it was only just before that conference, when we said they were going to boycott, they finally put a statement out. It doesn't go as far as I would like it to. And we really pushed their hand in that. But that was, you know, nearly 2 years of, well, 18 months of pushing them and pushing them to do that. So, and yet these are people who cite Bonhoeffer all the time. You know, lots of them call themselves ethicists, or they call themselves decolonial scholars, and they cite Bonhoeffer, they cite Martin Luther King, they praise these people for standing up against repressive regimes, and yet they themselves are being silent on Palestine. And we even met, you know, there are even some people who said to us, well, we can't sign your open letter because we have Jewish friends. Many people who signed the letter were Jewish. And, you know, we have to explain to them that what they were saying was anti-Semitic, that us criticizing the state of Israel was not anti-Semitic, but then them claiming they couldn't sign the letter because they have Jewish friends was actually anti-Semitic, because they are implying that all Jews agree with what Netanyahu is doing, and they do not. And several of them had signed our letter calling that out. So I think, yeah, the theological education institutions that are training people for the ministry have a huge responsibility to call out the weaponizing of the Bible against Palestinians, including Palestinian Christians, and they're just not doing that. You know, we ended our open letter with silence is complicity, and yet the response to that was, we disagree. And I'm sorry, well, you can't disagree. Like, silence is not neutral. Silence is complicity.
Yeah, I can see Sharon also answering some of the questions in the chat, so that's good for us. I don't know, Sharon, if you have anything to add before I go on to the next question, but
Sorry, I was really distracted typing.
yeah, no, we appreciate you answering some of the questions in the chat, since usually we can't get through all of them. So, but another question, well, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about the specific delegation you were on, because for folks who don't know, it was a delegation that had multiple theological educators from different contexts, including the US, Canada, and parts of Latin America. So I wanted to hear some of your reflections on, you know, whether it was beneficial to have kind of this global outlook and perspective on theological education in these different, you know, spots in the world, and where you see the collaboration between, you know, British institutions and other institutions globally, and what that future could look like in terms of collaborating on religion and ethics and theology.
Yeah, thank you. It was really interesting, engaging, being in a group of mixed people from, you know, different parts of the world in that way, particularly because theology is quite different in different parts of the world. And the way theology is taught is quite different in different parts of the world, and maybe not everybody was aware of that before the delegation. So I think the fact that we teach theology in a secular institution was a bit of a shock to some of the American theological educators, because church-state separation is a very different thing in America from in the UK. And so, yeah, the way we teach theology is very different too. So that was really interesting to be able to have that conversation, to be able to share experiences, and I think to continue this work together from our different perspectives, you know, and our colleagues there from Guatemala and Peru had very different experiences again. And one of the striking images for us when we were passing through occupied East Jerusalem was that some of the Israeli flags were hanging next to Argentinian, Uruguayan, Peruvian flags. And that was something we hadn't expected, that our colleague from Peru was able to explain to us a bit more about how Zionism operates in those countries. Christian Zionism is much, much bigger in America than it is in the UK. And Mitri Raheb talks about the different forms that Christian Zionism can take in that Decolonizing Palestine book. And I think what we find in the UK is more of the kind of emotional kind, rather than the very kind of fundamentalist or biblical literalist kind, that quite often Christian Zionists in the UK, they don't know very much about the history of the state of Israel and Palestine. And they just have this kind of vague, what they feel is like a vague emotional connection, as I said, with thinking, oh, but Israel's mentioned in the Bible, so shouldn't we stand by the state of Israel? And so that really needs unpacking for them. Whereas Christian Zionism feels like it's much more front and center in evangelical Christianity in America, and also in those Latin American countries that I mentioned as well. So being able to share those experiences, and then being able to, you know, continue after the delegation, sharing the ways in which we are now disseminating our experience through blogs and podcasts and publications, and the ways in which we teach theology.
Thank you. Sharon, do you have anything to add to this question?
No, I would absolutely concur with that. It was amazing experience to meet people from other parts of the world, and I genuinely hope we can kind of keep that group together, and build on friendships as well as the kind of work that we're doing.
Thank you both. I don't really see other questions, or there's some new questions happening. So one is just in a secular society, or I guess in secular institutions in the UK, do you get a lot of interest in theology or religion from students?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So most of our students are agnostic or atheist, but they are really interested. So, you know, the way I see this is that in the same way that students are encouraged to learn history or geography in order to understand other people, you need to study religion in order to understand what people think and believe and practice and why. And our students are interested in that. They have a looser connection with institutionalized religion, but they still have a sense that maybe there's something called spirituality, maybe there is something, you know, transcendent about the person. And so they are interested in those ideas. You know, they're interested in climate change, and maybe there's something about the sacredness of nature in that. So, you know, one of our modules is on theology and the environment. So they are interested in theological ideas. They can see how significant religion is globally, and that a lot of wars, tensions, have been caused by religion in various ways, but also a lot of the peace building work, a lot of the charity work is also carried out by religious groups, and they're interested in that too. So they're interested in the theology that underpins that sort of activism. And yeah, so that's probably where they're coming from when they study the subject with us.
And some of them do have a faith, quite a strong faith when they come to. It's quite a mix of students depending on the particular cohort. And I think in the third year we had 2 students who were interested in a vocation in the church. So that can be really good for the cohorts, that they're actually listening to students with a faith from different traditions of the church as well. But yeah, most of them come with they enjoy the sociology and the politics of religion, and and our numbers are growing, so I think it's becoming more more attractive to students when they look at what is happening in the world. They completely recognise there's a very important thing to learn about the role of religion.
I see Mervyn has a question. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, I'm Mervyn Russell. I obviously originally from Britain, but I've lived in Canada for many years. I'm a retired minister of the United Church of Canada. So I was very disappointed in what you had to say regarding uh, people who are training people for the ministry and their unwillingness to see Palestine as uh, uh, an instance of major injustice. Um, uh, is this, do you think, a reflection of the uh, Christian denominations that, in fact, they are working on behalf of and training ministers for?
Yes, essentially. I think a lot of them feel the need to kind of toe a party line, and so they need someone higher up in the denomination to come out strongly, speaking in support of Palestinian rights, for them to go along with that. But I also think it's wider than that, and I think it's about neoliberalism that has invaded academia as a whole, and people are very much more caught up in their individual concerns, rather than thinking about collective solidarity. And I find that quite disturbing, especially when they're talking about ethics.
May I say then, I mean, that is not the situation in Canada. The mainstream denominations here are pretty strongly pro-Palestinian rights and have strong critiques of the relationship between Israel and Palestine. I mean, certainly the tradition that I belong to here, the United Church of Canada, that is the case. Some of the strongest letters I've heard or read going to our government have come in actual fact from the executive of the United Church of Canada.
Yeah, and that's really great to hear. And the colleagues in Canada I was at the conference with just before we went were talking about that United Church in Canada has been really strong. It's not true of all the denominations in Canada, but because we have a state church here, it's been a real disappointment to us that the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was Justin Welby, now they're looking for a replacement because he's resigned for other reasons. But the Archbishop of Canterbury, every time he speaks, he has the ear of the press, and yet he's very mealy-mouthed. The concept of speaking truth to power has been very much watered down in relation to the state church, and it's taken a lot of hard work to push him to criticize the state of Israel, and to really speak strongly for Palestinians, and even to meet Palestinian Christians. And he was moving along that path. And Sabeel Kairos, who I'm a trustee with, have been working quite closely with the Anglican Church to push him in that direction. But then just when he started to move more positively in that direction, he then resigned. So yes, so the Church of England still has not said very much at all. The Quakers have been much better, and the Methodists are moving in the right direction. But yeah, there's very little coming out from the majority of denominations.
Just a quick word about the Theological Educational Institutes. Part of another project that I've done, I was involved with some teaching in one or two theological institutions for clergy people, and they welcome new ideas. They seem to be stuck. They can't even cope with feminist theology, which is not mainstream in their teaching. So some of them have to really stretch their programs and invite people in. So that's possibly a piece of work that we could be involved in. And I certainly think there's some research to be done in terms of small groups of Christians who are speaking out regardless of what their church environment allows them to do. So somebody mentioned Reverend Sue Parfitt in the chat. So that's what a brilliant example to kind of rally around. So I think there is research to be done on individual or small groups of visible Christians who are speaking out regardless of the institutional church. And I'm talking about the Church of England.
Thank you, Mervyn. Thank you for your question, and thank you, Esther and Sharon. We're approaching the end of the hour, so I just first of all wanted to thank you guys for the insights, and I hope that your work will continue to bear more and more fruit in the coming school years or academic years. And yeah, we thank you for your solidarity and your important work. I wanted to switch just in the last few minutes to speak about some actions. Because you guys are both located in the UK, there's actually one action conference happening in 17th of July next week that will be thinking about the 20-year anniversary of BDS. And it's happening at in London, Central Hall, Minster. Sorry, I cannot pronounce some British words. And so I'll put the link there if anyone who is based in the UK in this call want to attend. And that will be kind of a conference that will think about formulating action, nonviolent action, escalating BDS within the context of the UK. So I think that's a concrete action that I think might be a good uh, transition to the presentation you guys had. I don't know if you guys have any actions you want to share in your own context as well, to let people know. But that's just one that I wanted to let people know of. And then there's also a petition, the Sarajevo petition that recently came out, and we're asking people to sign. Some people in Cebu were involved in this process, so I'll just share that link. If you can sign that, it's based on the People's Tribunal, Gaza People's Tribunal. So you can sign that. And thank you again, Esther, Sharon. If you need to leave, feel free to leave, but I'll stay on for a few more minutes in case anyone has comments or thoughts to say about actions.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.